Rocks at the bottom of the ocean are making oxygen, and NASA is the reason we know that. Not plants, not algae, not any living thing at all. Lumps of mineral sitting in total darkness, 13,000 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, appear to be splitting water molecules and releasing breathable oxygen on their own. No sunlight, no biology, just rocks. And that discovery does not just rewrite what we know about Earth. It rewrites what we think is possible on every other planet in the solar system. But that is only one piece of what NASA found down there. Because when you follow this story all the way to the bottom, you realize that the deep ocean is not just a place scientists study, it is a rehearsal. A dress rehearsal for the most expensive, most ambitious, most important mission our species has ever planned. And right now, in the darkest, coldest, most crushing environment on our planet, the technology for that mission is being tested dive by dive. Let us start with a loss. In 2014, a deep-sea vehicle called Nereid Under Ice, which researchers called NERID, was on a dive near New Zealand in the Kermadec Trench. It had already produced over a dozen scientific publications from just 4 dives. It was a groundbreaking machine. It cost $14 million, and then it lost contact with its mothership and disappeared, gone instantly. $14 million in years of engineering, swallowed by the ocean in a single moment. That loss sent a shockwave through the deep sea research community. The deepest parts of the ocean, the Hadal Zone, the trenches that go beyond 6,000 meters, were effectively closed to long-term scientific exploration. Nobody wanted to risk another machine like that. Nobody had the budget to replace it. And so the deepest places on Earth sat largely unexplored, waiting. Until a biologist named Timothy Shank decided to rethink everything. Shank leads the Hadal Exploration Program, known as HEX, and his idea was so simple, it sounds almost obvious in hindsight. Stop building one massive, expensive, fragile machine and hope it survives. Build many small, cheap ones instead. If you lose one, you lose one. The mission continues. The data keeps coming. He called it the CubeSat philosophy, borrowing directly from the space industry, where tiny affordable satellites are launched in clusters rather than betting everything on a single billion-dollar spacecraft. And to build these small autonomous machines for extreme environments, he turned to the people who had been doing exactly that for decades. He turned to NASA. Together they built something called Orpheus, named after the figure from Greek mythology who descended into the underworld and returned. Orpheus is a new class of autonomous underwater vehicle. It weighs about 550 pounds. It is roughly the size of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, shaped like a hoagie sandwich, and it costs less than $200,000 to build. Compare that again to the $14 million machine they lost. 2 identical vehicles were constructed in 2018, named Orpheus and Eurydice, after the mythological pair who traveled through the underworld together. And here's one detail that sounds almost poetic. The syntactic foam that provides their buoyancy, a rigid flotation material made of microscopic glass spheres embedded in epoxy resin, came from spare material originally produced for James Cameron's deep-sea submersible. The same material that helped Cameron pilot a vehicle to Challenger Deep in 2012, the single deepest point on Earth, is now keeping Orpheus afloat in the trenches. But the real innovation inside Orpheus is not the foam or the hull, it is the navigation. In the deep ocean, there is no GPS. No satellite signal penetrates thousands of meters of seawater. If a vehicle cannot find itself, it cannot map anything, it cannot explore anything, and it almost certainly cannot come back. Traditional deep-sea vehicles solve this problem with acoustic positioning systems, expensive external infrastructure involving ships and transponders on the seafloor. Orpheus solves it a completely different way. The system is called Visual Inertial Odometry, or XVIO, and it was developed by engineers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It works like this. Orpheus carries a system of high-resolution cameras pointed at the seafloor as it moves. The software identifies distinct features in what it sees, rocks, shells, coral fragments, sediment patterns, and uses them as landmarks. As the vehicle moves, it tracks how those landmarks shift in its field of view and calculates its own position and velocity from that movement. Combined with instruments that precisely measure orientation and acceleration, the system builds a real-time picture of where the vehicle is, where it has been, and what surrounds it, without any external signal at all. Think of it like navigating a city using only street signs and your own sense of motion. You see the clock tower, you see the red building on the corner, you know where you are. Orpheus does the same thing, except the clock tower is a specific arrangement of rocks and shells on an abyssal seafloor that no human has ever seen. And this is not a new technology invented for the ocean. This is the same fundamental navigation system that helped the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover land safely in Jezero Crater on Mars in February 2021. The same algorithms that guided a spacecraft through 7 minutes of terror in the Martian atmosphere, through darkness and dust and chaos, are now guiding a submarine through the pitch-black water of the Pacific trenches. That connection is not coincidental. It is the entire point. Orpheus also remembers where it has been. The maps it creates during a dive are stored to memory. When it returns to an area, it recognizes the unique arrangement of features and uses that recognition as a starting point to push exploration further. And when multiple Orpheus vehicles work together, which is the whole idea behind the CubeSat philosophy, those maps can be shared and cross-referenced in real time. One vehicle finds something interesting, the others know about it immediately. The whole fleet converges. The vehicle also carries sensors that can detect the chemical signatures of hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, the chemical plumes of hot or methane-rich water that mark places where the seafloor is leaking energy from the Earth's interior. And it carries environmental DNA technology, sensors that can retrieve genetic material from organisms floating in the water or living in the sediment without ever physically capturing or disturbing them. You drive a robot past a field of organisms you cannot even see, and the sensors pull their DNA from the water column. Scientists can then identify what is there, what it is related to, whether it has ever been seen before. Orpheus was first tested in 2018. In May 2021, during a 2-week expedition aboard the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, it completed 8 dives and covered over 24 kilometers of seafloor. It built 3-dimensional mosaics of the ocean bottom. It detected chemical variations in the water column as it drove. And it did all of this autonomously, in total darkness, at pressures that would crush an unprotected human being in an instant. Now here's the question you should be asking. Why is a space agency building submarines? The answer is a moon called Europa. Europa orbits Jupiter. It is covered in a shell of ice roughly 12 kilometers thick. Beneath that ice, locked away from the rest of the solar system, scientists believe there is a liquid water ocean, a global ocean. And at the bottom of that ocean, the pressure is estimated to be roughly equivalent to the pressure at the bottom of Earth's Hadal zone. That is not a coincidence. That is the entire logic behind everything NASA is doing in the deep ocean right now. Every dive Orpheus makes is a test of technology that will one day need to operate under alien ice. Every navigation algorithm, every sensor, every mapping system is being hardened against an environment that shares the most critical characteristics of Europa's hidden ocean. Total darkness, extreme pressure, no external communication possible, complete autonomy required, no GPS, no mission control giving real-time instructions. The vehicle has to think for itself, make its own decisions, adapt to what it encounters. You cannot send a joystick command through 12 kilometers of ice and across hundreds of millions of miles of space. By the time any signal travels that distance, the moment it was sent for is long gone. The vehicle exploring Europa's ocean will need to decide on its own where to go, what to sample, when something is worth investigating further, and when to return to the surface. And the only way to build technology capable of that level of independence is to test it in the most challenging analog environment we have, which is the bottom of our own ocean. Saturn's moon Enceladus is also on the list. Enceladus is actively venting material from its subsurface ocean through cracks in its south polar ice shell. Scientists have already identified water, vapor, ice particles, organic molecules, and molecular hydrogen in those plumes. Molecular hydrogen, specifically, is exactly what you would expect to find if liquid water is reacting with rock in hydrothermal systems at the ocean floor, which means Enceladus may have active hydrothermal vents right now. And we already know what lies around hydrothermal vents on Earth. In 1977, scientists discovered something that changed biology forever. Working near the Galapagos Islands, they sent a deep sea vehicle down to investigate a thermal anomaly on the ocean floor. What they found made no sense based on anything science knew at the time. Around cracks in the seafloor where superheated, mineral-rich water was escaping from the Earth's interior, there were thriving ecosystems. Tube worms up to 2 meters long, clams and mussels larger than dinner plates, shrimp, crabs, fish, entire communities of organisms living in total darkness, miles below the surface, in water hot enough to dissolve metal. These creatures were not using sunlight. There was no sunlight. They were surviving through a process called chemosynthesis, where microorganisms convert chemical compounds, specifically hydrogen sulfide leaking from the vents, into organic material that other creatures then feed on. No photosynthesis, no solar energy. The entire food chain ran on the chemistry of the Earth's interior. Before 1977, every biologist on the planet assumed that all life on Earth depended either directly or indirectly on the sun. Photosynthesis drove everything. Plants converted sunlight into energy. Animals ate plants. Other animals ate those animals. The sun was the original source, always without exception. Going all the way back to the base of every food chain on the planet, the hydrothermal vent discovery shattered that assumption completely. Here were complex, abundant, thriving ecosystems that had never seen a photon of sunlight in their entire existence. The energy source was not a star, it was geology. And if life can exist without a star on Earth, then there is no fundamental reason it cannot exist without a star anywhere in the universe where the right conditions come together. Liquid water, a heat source, rock, chemistry. Those ingredients do not require a sun, they require geology, and geology exists everywhere. NASA scientists from JPL went to the deepest known hydrothermal vent system in the world, the Pickard Vent Field in the Caribbean Sea, which sits more than 16,000 feet below the surface. There, at temperatures where the vent fluid reaches 750 degrees Fahrenheit, they studied a species of blind shrimp called Rimicaris hybaceae. These shrimp pile on top of each other in dense clusters on the surfaces of the rock chimneys. They are completely blind. But they have heat-sensing receptors on the backs of their heads that let them feel the thermal gradient and position themselves at the razor's edge between scalding death and survivable warmth. 1 centimeter too close to the vent and they cook, 1 centimeter too far, and they lose access to the bacteria that keep them alive. Because those bacteria live inside the shrimp's mouths and on specially evolved gill covers. The shrimp farm microbes on their own bodies, and those microbes feed on the chemistry of the vent. The shrimp live on the microbes. The whole system runs without a single photon of light. And it gets stranger. When the shrimp cluster together densely, they feed on those bacteria. When they spread out, they turn carnivorous. They eat snails, they eat other crustaceans, and researchers found fragments of crustacean material inside their digestive systems. The most abundant crustacean in the area by far is the shrimp itself. They are eating each other. But hydrothermal vents are only one chapter of this story. The deep ocean has many more. In continental slopes around the world, between 500 and 1,000 meters beneath the surface, at pressures 50 times greater than at the ocean's surface, there are cold seeps, places where methane gas, trapped under enormous geological pressure in deep sediment deposits, finds pathways through faults and cracks and seeps upward through the seafloor. Where this methane meets cold ocean water, it can form structures called gas hydrates, also known as methane ice, where the gas becomes locked inside a lattice of water molecules, forming a solid material that looks like dirty ice but burns if you hold a flame to it. Around these seeps, ecosystems bloom, mussels and clams that host chemosynthetic bacteria in their tissues, tube worms, kilometers-long colonies of them, shrimp, small pink ice worms, only 1 to 2 inches long, that burrow directly into the surface of the methane ice and live there, a segmented worm that makes its home in frozen natural gas on the bottom of the ocean. Scientists still are not entirely certain how these ice worms feed, though the leading theory is that they graze on bacteria living on the methane ice surface. These cold seep ecosystems are not rare curiosities. They are found on virtually every continental slope on the planet where scientists have looked for them. Within just the 200-mile territorial waters off the U.S. East Coast, from North Carolina to the southern tip of Florida, researchers have estimated that methane hydrate deposits cover more than 130,000 square kilometers of seafloor. And some researchers have estimated that if you add up all the carbon locked inside gas hydrates worldwide and compare it to all the carbon in plants, animals, coal, and oil combined, the hydrates would account for roughly 60% of the total. 60%. These are not edge cases. They are a dominant feature of the planet's carbon cycle, and they are covered in life. In the Gulf of Mexico, on the seafloor above ancient salt beds formed when a prehistoric sea dried up during the Jurassic period more than 140 million years ago, there are brine pools, actual pools of liquid sitting on the seafloor like lakes within the ocean. The water in these pools is 5 times saltier than the surrounding sea, so dense that it sits separately with its own defined shoreline and its own wave action when disturbed by deep sea currents. Nothing can survive inside the pools themselves except microbes, but along the edges, mussels cluster in thick beds, fed by chemosynthetic bacteria in a closed loop of chemical energy that has nothing to do with sunlight. Scientists on the Orpheus team described the experience of driving a robot along the abyssal seafloor. Kilometers of essentially nothing, flat sediment, occasional tracks from organisms, a barren world, and then suddenly, without warning, life. Dense, rich, complex communities of organisms clustered around a vent or a seep, teeming in the darkness. One researcher called them oases, and they are everywhere scientists have looked for them, but the strangest discovery did not happen at the bottom of the ocean. It happened beneath it. In 2006, a large international research team led by scientists from Princeton and Indiana universities, supported partly by the NASA Astrobiology Institute, announced the discovery of a microbial community living 2.8 kilometers deep inside a South African gold mine near Johannesburg. The researchers had found a water-filled fracture in the rock during drilling and began collecting samples from it within days of its first opening to minimize contamination. What came out of that fracture was water, that had been completely isolated, no connection to the surface, no contact with the atmosphere, no interaction with sunlight or anything derived from it for tens of millions of years. And living in that ancient water were microbes. They were not feeding on anything that came from the surface world. They were drawing their energy from hydrogen and sulfate compounds produced by the slow radioactive decay of elements in the surrounding rock. The base of their food chain was a sulfate-reducing bacterium, and other microbes in the community fed on products generated by that primary organism. The entire ecosystem was powered by radioactivity, not nuclear reactors built by humans. The slow, patient decay of naturally occurring radioactive elements inside ancient rock, releasing just enough chemical energy to sustain life. These organisms had been sustaining themselves for longer than the human species has existed, completely isolated, completely independent, alive inside the rock. This is, by any reasonable definition, an alien form of life within the Earth. And at roughly the same time, a team from the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole used new genetic analysis tools to look past the most obvious microbial populations in deep sea samples and found something else, an enormous hidden diversity that nobody had expected. Species far outnumbered by the dominant organisms in their environment, but persistently present, stubbornly surviving, what researchers called a rare biosphere. At least 100 times more microbial species diversity than anyone had previously estimated. Why do these rare organisms persist? Some researchers believe they represent a biological backup system, a reserve population of diverse metabolic strategies that can swing into action if environmental conditions change in ways that threaten the dominant ecosystem. Life, in this view, does not just exist. It hedges. It maintains diversity precisely because conditions change, and in that hedging is something that looks a lot like long-term strategy. A multidisciplinary team from the University of Southern California, Caltech, JPL, and several other institutions has been exploring Earth's subsurface ecosystems through boreholes, mine shafts, sediment cores, marine vents, and deeply sourced springs. Their conclusion is direct. If life exists, or ever existed on Mars or any other planetary body in our solar system, evidence of it would most likely be found in the subsurface. Not on the surface, where radiation strips away organic molecules and liquid water cannot persist. Underground, in the rock, in the fractures. In the same kind of isolated, ancient, chemically energized environments where life clearly exists on Earth right now. NASA missions have already confirmed that Mars once had liquid water on its surface, ancient lake beds, river channels, evidence of a wetter, warmer past billions of years ago when conditions may have supported life, but Mars dried out. Its surface became inhospitable. If ancient Martian life existed and survived, it almost certainly retreated underground, into the rock, into environments chemically similar to the brine pools on the Gulf of Mexico seafloor, which are in turn chemically similar to what ancient Martian lakes may have looked like as the planet lost its water, became more saline, more acidic, more chemically concentrated. The parallel is not poetic. It is geological. NASA does not only send robots to the deep ocean, it sends people too. 62 feet below the surface near Key Largo in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, there's a structure called Aquarius. It is the world's only permanent undersea research station operated by Florida International University. And it is the centerpiece of a NASA program called NEMO, the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations Program. During NEMO missions, groups of astronauts, engineers, and scientists live inside Aquarius for up to 3 weeks at a time. They are called aquanauts. And while they are there, they simulate living on a spacecraft, test spacewalk techniques for future missions to the Moon, asteroids, and Mars, and run experiments that cannot be replicated anywhere else. The logic is that the undersea environment shares critical characteristics with space. Both are hostile to human life without extensive protective technology. Both require careful planning, tight resource management, and the ability to operate in an isolated and closed environment where mistakes can kill you. And through a technique called saturation diving, where the body becomes fully saturated with dissolved gas after 24 hours at any depth, the aquanauts can remain underwater for the full duration of a mission and surface safely with a predictable decompression schedule. NASA uses the water to simulate different gravity environments by adjusting the weight attached to each aquanaut, turning the seafloor into a stand-in for the Moon, Mars, or an asteroid. It is not metaphor. It is engineering practice. Now we come to the discovery that changes everything, the one that started this story, the oxygen that should not exist. Andrew Sweetman is a biological oceanographer at the Scottish Association for Marine Science. In 2013, he was studying the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a vast stretch of the Pacific Ocean floor spanning 4,500 kilometers, known mainly because it is littered with potato-sized lumps of mineral called polymetallic nodules. These nodules are rich in manganese, cobalt, nickel, copper, and other metals that have become critically important for electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy technology. But Sweetman was not there to study mining economics. He was there to study the seafloor ecosystem and how much oxygen it consumed. To measure that, he used sealed chambers placed on the seafloor with sensors inside called optodes that measure dissolved oxygen concentrations. The experiment was simple. You seal off a patch of seafloor. You measure the oxygen inside the chamber over time. The organisms living in the sediment consume oxygen. The level goes down. You calculate how fast it drops, and you understand how active the ecosystem is. That is how it has always worked. Except in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, the oxygen did not go down. It went up. Sweetman thought his sensors were broken. He threw them away. He came back with new equipment. Same result. He tried different optode sensors. Same result. For years, he could not publish this finding because it made no sense. Oxygen rising in a sealed chamber with no photosynthesis happening inside it is not supposed to be possible. Every mechanism scientists knew of that produces oxygen requires either sunlight or a living organism or both. He came back in 2021 with a completely different technique for measuring oxygen, using a method independent of optode sensors entirely. 25 separate experiments, the same result every time. Oxygen levels inside the sealed chambers rose. In some cases, the concentration tripled over roughly 47 hours. Independent measurements, using a totally different chemical method, confirmed it. The sensors were not broken. The oxygen was real. The first hypothesis was biological. Maybe deep sea microbes were producing oxygen through some unknown metabolic process. Scientists had recently shown that certain microbes can generate oxygen without sunlight through processes now called dark oxygen production. So Sweetman's team poisoned the seawater inside the chambers with mercury chloride to kill all the microorganisms. Mercury chloride kills every known taxon capable of biological dark oxygen production. And the oxygen kept rising. Whatever was making this oxygen was not alive. The second hypothesis was radioactivity. The polymetallic nodules contain trace amounts of radioactive elements, and radioactive decay can decompose water molecules in a process called radiolysis. But when the team modeled the contribution from radiolysis, it accounted for less than half of 1% of the oxygen they were measuring. It could not be radiation. Then in 2022, Sweetman was watching a video about deep sea mining and heard someone describe the polymetallic nodules as a battery in rock. It was a marketing phrase, a throwaway metaphor. But it stopped him cold. What if they actually were batteries? To understand why that matters, you need to understand what polymetallic nodules are. They are geological time capsules. A single nodule might take millions of years to reach the size of your fist, growing layer by layer as metals precipitate out of seawater and accumulate on its surface. Each layer is slightly different in chemical composition from the one before it. Manganese, cobalt, nickel, copper, iron, deposited in sequence over geological time. And that layered structure, with different chemical compositions at different depths and an internal arrangement that creates potential differences between layers, looks in electrochemical terms exactly like a battery. Sweetman's team tested the electrical potential on the surfaces of 12 nodules from 3 different areas of the Pacific. They used platinum electrodes and took measurements at 153 different sites on the nodule surfaces. They found voltage potentials of up to 0.95 volts. A standard AA battery produces about 1.5 volts. To split seawater into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis, you need a minimum of roughly 1.23 volts, plus additional energy to overcome resistance. That is more than any single nodule appears to produce on its own. But here's the key detail. The voltage threshold for splitting water can be significantly reduced if the reaction proceeds through a specific chemical pathway. And the nodule surfaces are enriched with exactly the kind of metal oxides, particularly manganese oxides, with specific structural characteristics, large internal tunnel structures, and abundant defect sites that are known to act as catalysts for this lower energy pathway. So the leading hypothesis is this. The polymetallic nodules on the abyssal seafloor of the Clarion-Clipperton zone may be functioning as natural geological batteries. The potential difference between their internal metal layers drives an internal redistribution of electrons. When those surfaces contact seawater, they may be splitting water molecules, producing hydrogen and oxygen in total darkness, under 4 kilometers of ocean, with no biological involvement whatsoever. Rocks making oxygen. On the floor of the Pacific Ocean, without life, without sunlight. The study was published in Nature Geoscience. It found that dark oxygen production correlated with the average surface area of the nodules. More surface area meant more oxygen. That is exactly what you would expect if electrochemical reactions were happening on the nodule surfaces, because more surface area means more reaction sites. But the researchers themselves have been careful to describe this as a hypothesis, not a confirmed mechanism. The oxygen production in the experiments was not constant. In most cases, it slowed and stopped after about 2 days. Some researchers believe this reflects what happens inside a sealed experimental chamber when reactants are consumed and products build up. In an open, undisturbed seafloor system, the reaction might continue indefinitely. Others are more skeptical. Some researchers have suggested that the lander itself may have triggered the reaction by creating a pressure wave that swept sediment off the nodule surfaces, exposing electrochemically active sites that are normally buried. If that is the case, it raises an immediate and urgent question. What happens when deep sea mining operations disturb those nodules on a massive industrial scale? We do not know. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone is currently the subject of enormous commercial interest. 16 companies hold mining licenses in the zone. The metals locked in those nodules, cobalt, nickel, copper, manganese, lithium, are the same metals that go into the batteries that power electric vehicles and energy storage systems. Some estimates suggest the nodules in this zone alone contain enough of these metals to meet global demand for electric vehicle production for decades. But half of the large animals living in the ecosystem, the megafauna, live exclusively on the surfaces of the nodules: fish, sea stars, sponges, and other organisms that exist nowhere else on the planet. And now we know the nodules may also be producing oxygen that the surrounding ecosystem depends on to breathe. The International Seabed Authority is still drafting regulations for deep sea mining. At least 32 member states have called for a moratorium, a precautionary pause, or an outright ban. The discovery of geologically produced dark oxygen adds another dimension to that decision that scientists and policymakers are only beginning to understand. If this phenomenon is real and confirmed, it has implications that reach beyond mining policy or even ocean science. If rocks can produce oxygen through electrochemical processes without any involvement from life, then the assumption that all oxygen in Earth's atmosphere ultimately came from living organisms using sunlight becomes a more complicated story. It means there may be an abiotic, non-biological source of oxygen operating right now on the ocean floor, and it means that when scientists search for oxygen in the atmospheres of exoplanets as a potential biosignature, as a sign of life, they will need to consider that the oxygen might not have come from life at all. The universe may be full of oxygen-producing rocks, and if such rocks exist on the floor of Europa's ocean, around its hypothetical hydrothermal vents, in the ancient fractures of Enceladus's warm interior, then the relationship between oxygen, chemistry, and life in those environments becomes one of the most important scientific questions our species has ever faced. All of this connects. Every piece of it. The Orpheus vehicles testing their navigation algorithms in the Atlantic trenches, the aquanauts running spacewalk simulations in the Florida Keys, the shrimp farming bacteria on their own bodies at 750-degree vent walls, the worms living in frozen methane, the microbes sustaining themselves for tens of millions of years inside gold mine rock on chemical energy from radioactive decay, the nodules producing oxygen in the dark. All of it connects to the same thread. Life does not need a star. Life does not need sunlight. Life needs liquid water, a heat source, and chemistry. And chemistry happens everywhere that rock and water meet under pressure and heat. On the floor of the Pacific, in the fractures of the Jovian moon, in the warm core of a small icy moon orbiting Saturn. The requirements for life, as we now understand it, are not rare. They are common. Maybe they are universal. One scientist on the Orpheus team described it this way: all you need is a warm core. You get that from gravitational forces. The gravitational pull from a large planet like Jupiter flexes Europa's interior constantly, generating heat. That heat cracks the seafloor. Water gets into those cracks. It gets heated. It picks up chemistry from the rock. It vents. And if what we have learned from Earth's deep ocean is any guide, life follows. We are not ready to go there. The technology that Orpheus represents will need to be shrunk by at least a factor of 10 before it can fit inside a spacecraft designed to reach Europa. The electronics will need to be hardened against the radiation belts that surround Jupiter, one of the most intense radiation environments in the solar system. The communication system, which on Earth relies on acoustic signals through water, will need to be adapted to operate under 12 kilometers of alien ice. The whole mission will need to survive years of transit through deep space before it ever touches water. We are decades away from that mission. Possibly several decades. But the development work is happening right now, on Earth, in our ocean, in the dark. Every time Orpheus descends into a trench, the engineers learn something. Every time the navigation system maps a new section of seafloor, the algorithms improve. Every time the environmental DNA sensors pull genetic material from the water column, the technology gets better. Every time a sealed chamber on the abyssal plain records oxygen rising where no oxygen should rise, science gets closer to understanding what is actually possible in a lightless, pressurized, chemically driven world. The deep ocean is not just a place to study. It is a mirror. It shows us what is possible. And what is possible down there in the darkest, most crushing, most chemically alien environment on our own planet turns out to be almost everything. Ecosystems without sunlight, life without photosynthesis, organisms sustaining themselves inside rocks for tens of millions of years on chemical energy from radioactive decay, rocks producing oxygen in the dark, autonomous robots navigating without GPS, building maps of territory no human has ever seen, guided by the same algorithms that land rovers on Mars. The answer to the question of whether life exists beyond Earth may already be waiting in the data we are collecting right now, not from a telescope pointed at a distant star, from a small autonomous submarine the size of a motorcycle driving across the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, recording chemical signals and building maps in total darkness, getting ready for the journey of a lifetime. We went down there looking for answers. We found questions instead. Better questions. Harder questions. Questions that connect the deepest trench on Earth to the frozen moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Questions that challenge what we thought we knew about where oxygen comes from, where life can exist, what life even needs to survive. The deeper we go, the stranger it gets.